Good evening, everybody, and welcome into Understanding Grief with Julie Weatherhead. We're getting started formally with the presentation in roughly 15 minutes, but while you're waiting, you might notice in the chat that there is a link to a survey that Julie has built for you guys as a little bit of a participatory element for today's presentation. So make sure to go check that out. This is a good time to answer a couple of her questions to better help you today during the presentation. We'll be getting started in just a little bit. Welcome into Understanding Grief with Julie Weatherhead. We'll be getting started in about 5 minutes. So if you haven't already, head over to the chat and you'll see there's a link to a quick little survey that Julie's put together to help with tonight's presentation. And if you've already done it, but you think you have a little bit more you'd like to add, you're welcome to fill it out a second time. So you can find that link at the top of the chat. Hello, everybody, and welcome into tonight's program with the Schaumburg Library, Understanding Grief, presented by Julie Weatherhead. My name is Chris. I'm the Adult Programs Coordinator at the Schaumburg Library, and I am so happy to be spending this evening with you guys. Now, before we jump in and get started, just a few of our friendly Zoom reminders. The first one is closed captioning has been enabled, and if you'd like that for tonight's presentation, make sure you turn that on using your Zoom toolbar. If at any point during today's presentation, you're having technical difficulties, you can reach out to me directly using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll be actually using the chat tonight as a participatory element to today's presentation. So I want to make sure that that stays for that so that your questions and any problems you're having don't get lost in the participation that's happening in the chat. So make sure you use the Q&A if you need any help tonight, and I'll be able to help you directly using that. The Q&A is also a great place to drop any questions you might have for the presenter for once we get to the end of the presentation. And Julie might actually take a couple of those as well as we go along. So remember to use the Q&A for any questions you have for me or the presenter. That way that chat can be better utilized for all of the fun participatory parts of today's presentation. And speaking of participatory parts of the presentation, there's already one in there, and I'll reshare the link real quickly. So you'll see in the link pop up a little poll that Julie has created. So make sure to go and use that. She's looking for a couple of words that you guys think of when you think of grief. So if you go in, just click that link real fast, fill out that poll. Julie's going to be able to collect that data and really quickly be able to utilize it to help better give this presentation today. And I know she's really excited to get started with you guys, and I'm sure you guys are really excited to hear her presentation. So without further ado, let me introduce Julie so that we can get this grief party started. I don't know if grief party is the right word for it, but I've chosen to roll with it. Julie Weatherhead is a professional griever who lost her brother at the age of 13 and recently lost her grandparents during COVID. She is also a licensed professional counselor and consultant who specializes in grief. She's the director of a company called Weatherhead Counseling and Consulting, as well as a small nonprofit called Got Grief House, better known as Gigi's House, which serves grievers of all ages. She also acts as an adult counselor for an annual homicide-specific grief camp outside of Chicago called Camp Sheila. She lives in Detroit with her dog and loves spending time with her family and friends. Please, everyone, give a wonderful virtual welcome to Julie Weatherhead.
I'm receiving your silent applause. I'm receiving it. Thank you guys so much, so much for showing up for this tonight. Grief is obviously something really important to me. It should be really important to everyone because it's one of the only things that all of us are most likely going to go through in our lifetime. I'm going to start off by sharing my screen, and thank you so much for the words that you put in the chat. I see the words that you think of for grief. I see intense sadness over loss. I see tearful anger. I love that one, very descriptive. Ironically enough, the poll that I sent you guys, I was just trying to pull it up and it's broken down. And so if you did enter some things into the poll, that's fine. You can also enter them into the chat though. That's completely fine. I appreciate you participating and again, just showing up today. So let me share here. Okay, so understanding grief, how we identify it, how we cope with it, and how we grow with it. Before we get started, I want to practice something that we're going to do at the end of this presentation as well. So being here might have triggered some emotions for some of you. Some of you might have come just because you're curious to know about how to tackle this issue when it does come into your life. Some of you might have already dealt with it and looking for more guidance, but grief tends to bring in a lot of emotions. And in Chinese medicine, they attribute emotions to organs, and they attribute grief to your lungs, which to me makes a lot of sense. because I know from some of my experiences of grief, it can feel suffocating, it can feel heavy. And so when we take big, deep breaths, it can be so helpful to let some of that emotional energy out of our body. So do me a favor, and before we get started, we're going to practice a nice deep breath. And we're going to breathe in through our nose. We're going to hold it. And then we're going to breathe as slow as we possibly can out of our mouth. And it's the slow out breath that will trigger your vagus nervous system. This is scientifically proven that when we have that slow out breath, you are telling your body, I am safe, I am okay. You are releasing some of that anxious, maybe some of that energy that's in your body from whatever's happening in your life. So on the count of three, well, first of all, just get comfortable so you can take a deep breath in. And on the count of three, we'll breathe in through our nose for 4, we'll hold for 4, and then we'll breathe out as slow as we possibly can. Don't forget to breathe beforehand too. I forget to breathe sometimes. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, breathe in through your nose. And hold for 4, 3, 2, 1, and slow out breath. You can do it again if you want. Breathe in. And hold it. 4, 3, 2, 1, and slow out breath. Right. And breathe normal. And as Chris said, let's get into this grief party. Let's get into it. So understanding grief, how we identify it, how we cope with it, and how we grow with it. So this is a picture of my co-founders for Got Grief House, or Gigi's house. And we jokingly, lovingly say, nobody wants to go to Got Grief House. Everybody wants to go to Gigi's house. And so that is our name. And we do adult grief groups, and we do children's programming and family programming in Detroit. And you can see, well, my pink hair for me was a response to grief. This was during COVID when I couldn't go anywhere, do anything. And I was like, I need something. I need to cope with this. So I coped with creativity. But yeah, this is us knocking down the door of grief to normalize this process together. So this is one of the quotes that I really love. And you guys might have heard this. If you're old enough to love, you're old enough to grieve. Being somebody who was a child who experienced very sudden and traumatic loss, and my brother was pretty close with in the home, I found that children's grief often can be unrecognized. So this is something that I really love to uplift to everyone and anyone that I speak to about grief, is that everyone has the ability to grieve. It might come out over time, but it's definitely something that can be there, even for little babies, right? They have attachment to people, certain people in their life. So entering in one word that you think of to describe grief: tearful anger, intense sadness over loss. The other words that we had, I'm going to pull them up because I am able to see some of them. It said sadness, pain, loss, hurt, death, and ending. Yeah, it can be an ending. It can be also a beginning of something else. Cheated, loneliness. Yeah, those are definitely words. Thank you for popping those in there. We're going to explore really a full explanation, or a fuller explanation of, what is grief besides these feelings, because it's this combination of feelings. But what are some more technical ways too to talk about it? So I really like this definition. Grief is an emotional recognition that something is missing. We can miss what has been, a person, a thing, a relationship, or a commitment that no longer exists. We can also miss what has never been. And that's from obviously Denise and Michael. Surreal. Yes, I see that in the chat. It is surreal. There's something that as we are normalizing and talking more about grief in our society, these other types of grief that you see on there are things that are now being talked about, at least amongst therapists and people who focus on grief as something that they like to support and learn more about. So secondary losses. People don't tend to think about that very often, right? So if a main caregiver dies, that's maybe a whole paycheck that's now missing. And that now puts people in a financial burden or financial loss. They have to process all this paperwork and they have to get through all these barriers after somebody dies. So secondary losses from the main loss is a very big thing that a lot of us don't think about until we're actually maybe in that situation and feeling it. Anticipatory grief. So my tete, which is Arabic for grandmother, she had dementia and she was older. And I knew she was going to die fairly soon, right? So this anticipatory grief, which can also sometimes happen with chronic illness, is losing somebody mentally and emotionally, or starting to process that loss a little bit earlier than when they actually physically depart us. So that describes this, again, anticipatory grief, or you could even call it real-time grief sometimes, right? Because when somebody has Alzheimer's or dementia, sometimes their personality drastically changes. So sometimes we begin to mourn that person a little bit earlier than maybe physically they leave us. Or if again, like if you're going to be moving out of a house for some reason, and this house means a lot to you, and maybe you don't want to move out of the house, but you're going to have to. So sometimes we have these feelings of grief before it actually is coming into fruition of what's happening. The last one that you see here is disenfranchised grief. Not having the space or validation to grieve. And as I mentioned earlier, with children, this happens a lot. And I know from experience, unfortunately, from when I was younger, my brother's death was kind of public. My family was pretty involved in the community. And my parents had done some memorialization stuff after, which is really wonderful. They put their energy into that. But nobody really ever asked about us, me and my sister, how we were doing. We were kind of just functioning, right? We were put back into school pretty quickly and expected to kind of move forward. And I talk to parents all the time and families all the time who admit to thinking like, I don't know if they are grieving, and I'm like, yeah, there's something going on in there. They might just be guarding you from that, or they might be feeling like they shouldn't, or they aren't grieving because they're not supposed to, right? So I don't know, kids and adults are very interesting in that way. Another example of disenfranchised grief, sorry for the background noise, is if somebody commits a big crime and maybe they're put into prison, and this person is framed, as a bad person or somebody who made a very bad choice. And so disenfranchised grief might look like, well, am I supposed to grieve this person? Right? They were still somebody in my life. They were still somebody I had a connection to. Or maybe it's a parent who's absent, who's still living, and you're grieving that relationship. But again, you also have these feelings of anger, and the people around you, maybe aren't asking you like, how do you feel about that not existing? So sometimes we have, again, not the space or validation from others around us that you might be grieving. You might, you're feeling other feelings too, maybe, but there's probably some grief in there as well. Thank you, Sandra, for putting that in there. Unfair. That does feel unfair sometimes. Disenfranchised grief. I see infertility. Yeah. Yeah. We can also, in the definition you see, we can also miss what has never been, right? So there's so many different types. Absolutely. And you can see from this slide, I just posted this. Yesterday was the National Grief Awareness Day, actually. And again, we don't know about it because we don't really talk about it much. I almost missed it myself, and I'm a grief counselor, but I really enjoyed this slide that I kind of put out to my networks. Things we grieve: loss of a loved one, a breakup or divorce, loss of a pet. Things we might also grieve, right? And there's so many other things that aren't on there that could be included. I really like the effects of a big decision, even when those decisions are ultimately good for us. We can still grieve what was. The person we were before something traumatic or life altering occurred. We can grieve that in real time. A faith transition or a shift in our other beliefs. When big major world events happen, or I know with the access to internet, we have access to so much world news, so much information, especially for our young people, where their views and their values and their understanding of things are shifting a lot. And it can be very jolting. You can grieve a diagnosis of something, the unknown. So there's a lot. And if you think of any others, you can put it in the chat for sure. This is meant to be a very interactive time. So, what makes grief experiences unique? I was shocked. I don't want to say shocked, but I was surprised at how different my grief experience was for my grandparents versus my brother. My brother died 25 years ago, 26 years ago. I'm 39 now, but he died a very long time ago, but I still vividly remember so much of it. And my grief was a little bit disenfranchised, like I was saying earlier. So I actually didn't end up grieving very hard into college. That was a really big time for me when I went away from home, and people started asking me about my family, and I start processing things more. And all of a sudden people are curious about my life in a different way. So anyways, but I was shocked at how different the loss of my grandparents was, how it affected my body physically. I was a caregiver for my grandparents. They're a very big part of my life. But yeah, it was just so different. And it just was a really good reminder that everything is unique, everything is different. The loss of an adult child is so hard. Yes, Diane. Yeah. So many losses and different relationships that you have with the people that die. Or knowing the relationship you might have, if it was an infant. So the relationship with the person that died, the circumstance of the death, how did the person die? And we really want to stay away from this is worse than that, or that's worse than that. Comparing our loss experiences to other people is not, it can be a tough thing to do, because then you disenfranchise your own grief, right? Well, my death was nothing like what that person experienced, so I shouldn't, feel as bad as that person feels, right? No, you have your own set of experiences, your own set of emotions, and those are validated and those are real. So your past experiences with death and loss, that can impact how you've learned about grief, right? So for my grandparents, since I've learned so much about grief from when I was young to being such a big support for other people going through other losses in my life, my grandparents' death still hit me very hard, very hard. But I was a little bit more prepared in the sense that I knew that I had to deal with it, and I had to engage in different ways and try different things to deal with it. So what is your physical and mental health at the time? Again, life stage, developmentally and experience wise. So when a child loses somebody, as they grow up, sometimes they realize what that loss means to them in their life as they see their peers and see other interactions, and they think about, well, what about my wedding, or what about this, or What about these milestones this person might miss now? Your culture and your faith and your spiritual beliefs, right? Some cultures and faiths really have some great rituals and routines that very much put grief out in the open. And some rituals of cultures are very old school, and this is the way we do it, and we don't talk about it anymore. Oh, Jean, I love that. Tsunami waves of emotion, roller coaster of emotions. Yes. Media exposure and information. So what makes grief experiences unique? If your death that you experienced was very high profile, so that homicide specific grief camp that I've been working at probably for the last 7 years, some of those people that come to this camp, they have to be reminded of this loss over and over again as they're looking maybe for the person that killed their loved one, and it's being brought up that it's an open case, or or it's getting sensationalized on the news, and that can make an experience very unique depending on how that goes. And then time. So grief experiences, and it looks like a lot of you guys have been through some grief already, and you might already know this, but the 3-month mark, that's a very tough time, I would say. So maybe when you lose somebody and it's public and people know about it, because again, there's so many types of grief that people don't even realize people are going through. But I know that when person-centered loss, the first 3 months, usually there's a good amount of support, right? It's pretty fresh in people's minds, and maybe there was a funeral, or maybe there's a ceremony that people came to, and people recognize that, like, yeah, this is really, you're hurting. But very often at the 3-month mark, it will seem sometimes that people will move on, right? Other people will move on, and then all of a sudden the griever is like, oh my gosh, this is still actually happening, right? And so um, your grief experience can change over time. It can become more intense, it become less intense as you learn about your grief and how it shows up, what your triggers are. You can learn how to deal with it in a different way, how to hold it, right? So it's just so unique. Every type of loss, every aspect of it. Sandra put some numbness in there, yeah. So I put grief in here, right? What is grief? And I also put trauma in here. So sometimes trauma can be intersected with grief, and that's on the next slide, but experiencing a loss or grief can be traumatic. And trauma is, and I'll read this definition out loud. In general, trauma can be defined as a psychological, emotional response to an event or an experience that is deeply distressing or disturbing. There's primary trauma you experience. It can be acute, a one-time incident. It can be chronic or complex, varied in multiple instances. So I want to talk about the acute one-time incident or chronic and complex. I know that some of the kiddos that I work with and some of the people that I get to work with in my private practice, sometimes it seems like there's multiple losses over a very short period of time. And that can feel traumatic and chronic, right? Like, what is going on? Like, I remember even when my brother died, I started just listening and recognizing, like, man, people really people are dying all the time, right? It is a function of life. We are born, we're brought into this beautiful world, and at one point we die. And hold on a second, something popped up. But yeah, for some people it can be chronic, especially in areas where you see that maybe there is a high homicide rate or rate of violence, where trauma is kind of happening all the time, and then sometimes we become normalized. It can be acute, so a one-time incident, but it has a really big impact on your life. So as supporters of community, of the people that we love, there is secondary trauma. So if you've been through a big loss and then you're supporting somebody else sometimes, or you hear about another loss that maybe you're not even that related to, sometimes it can trigger your experience that was traumatic or left a big impact on you. There's vicarious trauma, happens slowly after time, over time, after continual exposure. So during COVID, that was really tough, right? Like how much we have to watch that about ourselves. How much do we expose ourselves to these things that we know are going to be a little damaging to us, possibly? Like how much are we going to watch the news to see what's happening for that big event? As we're having these big events in our world that are sometimes connected to grief and loss, sometimes you need to maybe take a break from media of any sorts or exposure to trauma, and put yourself in a place of peace so you can ground and be in your body and know that you are safe. As you see, it says put the oxygen mask on you first. So even if you are the person that everybody goes to for support, you have to be mindful of how it's impacting you, right? You have to take care of you first, and you have to understand what space you have, to support others, especially if you're in moments where you're like, I think I need to take some space and lean into my supports or practice my grounding skills. So, as I said earlier, grief and trauma often intersect. Um, Both of them can be repressed when we push feelings deep down and pretend like they don't exist. Um, and sometimes our brain will do that to protect us. So I'll tell you, the year that my brother died, I don't really remember a lot. I was 13 years old, and you usually have a pretty decent memory of what happens in your life. But my brain was protecting me and kind of shutting down in some ways. I was able to function very well, and I had good grades. And I remember my cousin was like, it didn't even seem like you were upset. I was very upset. I was struggling. I was struggling with the trauma from being with him when he died, right? Which luckily I got some assistance for. I mean, my family was a family that didn't believe in counseling, maybe still doesn't. But we had family friends that dealt in trauma, and they could see that I was impacted from the trauma. It was interesting because I recognized that the trauma was getting addressed, but my grief didn't get addressed, because they intersect, but there also can be two separate things that need different types of attention, as I said. So when we repress things, when we push them down, any sort of traumatic event, any sort of grief, it eventually may become triggered. It might be like, for me, it was when I went to college and went away from my home space, and I moved into a new space, and all of a sudden it was kind of triggered because everybody was kind of asking me about it, and I had time to think about it. Finally, I wasn't, as busy as I was in high school. Um, and it can be triggered, I say this too, in our mind, body, or behavior. Sometimes we have a hard day at work and we come home and we end up saying something really stupid to the person that we live with, or really like out of line, or really, you're annoyed, or sometimes your body can get really tired, because your emotions, again, and you'll see I have a whole slide about it. Your emotions are energy and they impact us. It's called somatics, when your feelings show up in your body, and you guys might know about that. That's why we did this breathing, to signal to our body, you're safe, you're okay, you can be calm, right? We need to communicate, because there are other signals happening sometimes when we get triggered from our grief, or when we get triggered with other emotions. I put in here, how do we redefine the term strong, and how do we normalize and grow with our grief? So this is one thing about when things happen that are traumatic, or in our life, which losing somebody can be traumatic. It also can be something very natural, where people aren't in a lot of pain. They can be happy that this person is not in pain anymore, right? If they're in a chronic illness, or they were struggling. We can't always assume that people are hurting big time, right? We have to be curious. But one thing that I always hear is like, "God, you're so strong," especially when we say that to kids. And I really want to redefine, what is strong, you know, to be able to be vulnerable in front of people, to be able to cry in public, which, oh my gosh, as a 13-year-old kid, it was like a deadly sin. I know, like, terrifying. But sometimes also as an adult, I think that sometimes we feel the same, right? Where if we're triggered by our grief, or if it comes up and we're in a public place, and sometimes we don't feel safe to let our emotions out. Um, or sometimes we just don't want to, right? We don't want to be seen as, some people would say, weak. Sometimes as a society, especially for men, we frame crying as weakness. But when we're hurting, being vulnerable and being able to share our emotions, being able to be in our grief, that's strong. Being able to level with it and say, you know what, I'm having a really hard time today. I need some space, or I might need to take a half day off, or I need to go to the bathroom. I need to take a walk. I need to go sit in my car, or I need to just cry right now. Recognizing again, like recognizing what grief is, how does it show up in you? How do we cope with it? And how do we grow with it? And when I say grow with it, it's being able to now recognize when it's coming or when it's triggered, and then being able to recognize, what do I need to take care of myself right now? And, how do I get back to me so I can continue to function what I'm doing, or so I can remove myself and make sure that I am supporting myself in whatever way feels best to me. So that's that, how do we normalize these intense reactions that can come up, right? 25 years later, I was doing an interview, and I started talking about my brother, and yeah, I teared up, and there's tears coming down, right? I think the thing with grief is, you know, some people will say, like, you got to move on. Ah, I always like to say we have to move forward. Moving forward. We don't have to move on, because you're never going to stop grieving that thing, or that person, or that really, sometimes even that relationship, how it felt. You could even be in a happy relationship, and sometimes you can think about that other relationship. Sometimes, how long you dwell on that might not be so healthy, but I will never stop missing my brother. I will never stop grieving my grandparents. It's just about how I find ways to do it, how I find ways to take care of myself. How much is my grief impeding my life, and what support can I get around that? Those are the big questions about it. We don't need to move on and pretend like it never happened, because it did. And we're human. So what makes us human is we have emotions, we have relationships, we have ties with people. So how do we grow with that? Sometimes another analogy is, your grief can be as small as a pebble sometimes, and it can be in your pocket. And sometimes it's a big boulder on your back, and it's heavy as heck. And sometimes you might need somebody to help take that off your shoulder, right? Sometimes it's a tsunami of waves of emotion, and you might need a stronger surfboard. Like, you need to just surf those waves. You need to survive, right? Survive these big waves of grief that come. And that's okay to figure out those ways, like, how can I get through this? Because it is hard, and there's no shame in it being hard. I always say the first year is very hard. The first 5 years is pretty hard. Your brain is still adjusting to this loss, this change that's happening. So it's give ourselves time, be kind to ourselves and others. So as I was saying earlier, body map, this is emotions are energy. So this is some research that was done to show this heat map, right? Of, like, what our bodies look like when these emotions are happening. And you can see, depression, we feel a little bit cool. I'm sure we slow down a little bit. Anger, you can see where it's at for that. Happiness, you can see where it's at for that. Anxiety. So again, like, there is scientific proof that our brain is a part of our body. What we think and what we feel impacts our whole being. So it's so important to be able to recognize it. So I'm assuming that you guys have heard of the 5 stages of grief. And there's other theories that are out there, right? I like this picture of it a lot, because the 5 stages of grief, it was presented in a way where people thought, well, okay, I go from this stage to this stage to this stage to acceptance, and I'm done and I'm good. And for some people, maybe it is like that. But for a lot of people, it is more like this. It's all over the place, right? Sometimes I saw numbness, right? That can be part of that denial or isolation or just that shock of like, I still haven't really processed it, especially sometimes if you didn't live with that person or if that person traveled a lot, it's really hard to have to remember sometimes. Your brain is reminded and it has to process that loss all over again. And it can be a little bit of a shock to the system. And these are, some normal emotions that can happen. Bargaining can look like, well, if I would have done this or I should have done this, ruminating on those things, that can happen too, which is something that, we can't go back in time. And, hopefully we get support when these things come up, right? When depression comes up, when big anger comes up. And support can look like support from a licensed professional counselor, who specializes in grief. It can look like a grief group that you go to maybe once a month just to make space for these feelings, just to be witnessed, because you don't expect somebody to solve it. But sometimes, in our grief groups, we share tools, and sometimes it just feels good to have a cry in front of people and with people. I want to say in front of with people. Yes, I'm looking in there, Amy. The 5 stages were developed by observing dying people, not grieving people. Grief is a lot more complicated than those 5 stages. Heck yes, sister. Yes, it goes beyond the 5. Absolutely. Let me go on to this. So when we say it goes beyond the 5, this is a feelings wheel. I don't know if anybody's ever seen this, but this is a tool that I love to use with people in my own life, with my clients. I love to give copies of this to people because sometimes our feelings are so intense and they're so a part of us. I've noticed that people, including myself, you can't even speak words, right? Like your brain feels so foggy and you're not really sure what you're feeling. You're just kind of in a space. And that can happen, for all of this. And so, again, recognizing that we can have more than one emotion at one time. We can have emotions that are outside of these quote unquote 5 stages of grief, stages rather. But yeah, if you just look up feelings wheel, this is a beautiful, wonderful tool for something we call emotional literacy or emotional intelligence, right? How can we recognize the emotions that are happening within us? How can we communicate them to ourselves to recognize, okay, this is what I'm feeling, or to others who are concerned and want to support and love us, being able to describe the experience. And then, of course, once we understand what we're feeling, we get to figure out how we're going to cope with that. How do we cope with those feelings? How do we make space for them intentionally, on purpose, in real time, or planning ahead of time? I'm going to go back to this. So, something that is a theory that I do really enjoy and that makes a lot of sense to me is they call it oscillating grief. So, it's funny to me because you picture an oscillating fan where the fan is moving around the room, right? Just like I was saying, sometimes your grief is a pebble and sometimes it's a boulder. So, a theory of grief and how it can happen, right, is that it can be very intense sometimes, right? When there's an event or when you're triggered. And then when it oscillates away, it is important and can be important to cope in joy, right? Because grief can produce some very intense sadness. And so when that grief can oscillate away and we need a break from grief. That's what I'm saying, right? We need to try to give ourselves a break from grief. So when we talk about coping, it's all the things. It doesn't have to be directly related to your emotions or making space for the sadness. It's also making space for joy and distraction and laughter. Remembering that you can laugh, that it's in there. It exists. That part of you still exists, even if it's feeling a little bit more dormant. It's still there. So, grief support Come up with a plan, baby. And again, when it's first happening, it's pretty hard to plan for it. I mean, unless you're intentionally reaching out for support and maybe walking through this path with a grief counselor. But when it first happens, I mean, sometimes it can be, again, a very big state of numbness, of just feeling intense sadness, which is normal, right? You might feel like you can't cry anymore and you just don't know how you can keep crying. But you know that crying is catharsis, right? That's releasing of emotions. And it's okay to continue to cry. Even for me, 25 years later, when I still have some tears for my brother, for that loss. So grief is hard. um, Triggers and or coping may happen around the holidays. And a holiday could be that person's birthday. It can be an anniversary. It can be a holiday that you celebrated in a certain way. It can be a ritual that you did with that person and now you do by yourself. Um, a trigger can happen for me. It was when I was setting the table and I grab, when I was young, and I would grab a plate for my brother. I wouldn't even think about it because, again, my brain hadn't really processed the loss in that way yet, right? Because we have a map in our brain. I'm kind of going off the slide here right now, but there's a book about the science of grief. It came out pretty recently. And one of the concepts that I really enjoy that they did some research about is, and they explained is like, when the lights are off in your house and you're wandering around, you know how to not run into the table. You subconsciously know your home, your space, you know where things are. And that's your 3D map of the world that you live in, right? And when you have a person that's in your life all the time and that person is now gone, your map of your brain is slow to change. Just like it's hard to change neural pathways, right? And try new things and learn new things. Oh, Monica, that was an amazing book. I really like it too. Highly recommend The Science of Grief for sure. The 3D map, that's why we have to be patient with ourselves and not be so surprised when we still feel a little triggered, right? I think though too, and Jean, I see you said every day is a trigger, right? It's wondering, okay, if the trigger's happening, then what's happening next, right? You're making space for the feelings. Are you able to continue moving through your day in a certain way? Is there something that you can do to help? And when I say ground yourself, a trigger is what we would like to say can become ungrounding. It can, my dog is here, sorry. It can change our path of thinking. It can take us on a roller coaster of emotions, as some people had said, right? And the question is when we want to stop feeling those intense feelings, do we have ways to trigger ourselves back into our body, to trigger ourselves back into comfort, or to switch the train ride, switch tracks for a second? And that's, the coping skills that are so important to explore and try and practice. And making a plan in advance can be very helpful sometimes. But sometimes when you get to there, you don't even need the plan because you're feeling totally different. So being able to try to plan for your grief. So for me, that means that I would take the day of my brother's death, his death anniversary, I would just straight up take that off of work. At first I didn't. At first I struggled. Then I eventually had the guts to tell somebody within my workspace that, this is the day. It's really tough for me. So I don't know what's going to happen. I might have big feelings. I might not. And then eventually I started just taking the day off, which was kind of nice. And again, it depends on where you are in life and what you can do and how safe you feel doing things. But I was trying to plan. And then sometimes I grieved so much up to the date that when the date came, I was feeling pretty okay, right? So you make a plan and you don't even need the plan, but that was a reminder of me being like, okay, well, maybe this is a sign that I need to go experience some joy today, right? So it's really wonderful to think about who are the people that feel safe to me. Do I know how I want to be supported yet? And you might not know yet, but as your grief develops, you usually become aware of what feels good and what feels not so good. Excuse me. So who can you talk to? Where can you go? What's a place that's comforting to you? And it could be comforting and sad at the same time, right? So going to their favorite restaurant, eating their favorite foods, or maybe eating your favorite food to help comfort you and give yourself some reprieve from that grief, right? Um, using the five senses to cope. So it says triggers and or coping may happen around the holidays or five senses. So sometimes we could be triggered by smelling a certain smell that reminds us of that person. Or we'll see a food. So for me, it's grape leaves, that my tete would make. It makes me think of my tete. She loved um, Etta Fitzgerald. So when I hear that, I'm triggered. But I'm now to the point where I can be triggered in a little bit of grief and joy. Sometimes the grief is bigger, sometimes the joy is bigger, but I continue to learn about that because that grief is pretty fresh for me. So I'm still learning about the ways to comfort myself. But it's very important to think about those things. And, if you have anxiety, I work with people in all ways in counseling, like what helps you stay calm if you feel like today at work's going to be a really hard day and I'm going to go anyways. I have this smooth rock, rough rock, right? Tiny things you can put in your pocket and just hold on to focus on when your brain is kind of wandering or going to a place that you really don't feel comfortable and ready to go yet. Scents can be very calming. Lavender, obviously, but there's also other scents that can be calming. And it could be related to if it's a person-centered loss. Noise. If it's a person-centered loss, it could be the perfume. I spray my tete's perfume on me sometimes when I'm having like a big joyous event that I'm going to, and I want to bring her with me. I know the scent that she liked. I know this, and I like to think of in the ways of supporting me is how can I maintain this relationship with this person that I loved, even though they're physically not here? Can I spiritually imagine and continue to be with them in different ways? And a lot of my clients, they'll talk to their loved ones, or you can maybe go visit them. I have a necklace here that has my brother's thumbprint and his initials on it. It's very low key, right? Where some people have pictures of their person on a dog tag, which is beautiful, right? You get to choose how you cope, and you get to try out different ways and start to figure that out as you grow with your grief. So it is 8:47, and I really wanted to open up time for any questions or comments. I do have more slides, and I do want to practice breathing before we leave together. But
Hey,
first, I do want
Julie,
to open it up for questions if anybody has any.
just while people are thinking of some questions they want to ask, first off, I just wanted to say thank you for a wonderful presentation. I can just see how much the guests through the chat have enjoyed this conversation with you. And what a good job of making something that is this virtual platform feel so conversational and almost like you're in a room with us. And also, has anyone ever told you have like the most soothing voice that ever existed?
Oh,
You
okay.
have a very calm voice. I was like, this is a person who knows how to be a counselor, just like really like bring people down in a way to be able to actually converse. One question I always like to ask all my presenters, and I usually save it for the end, but I love the idea of us ending with the breathing exercise. So I want to try and get in before the guests throw their questions down in the Q&A, which reminder, throw those down now. One thing I like to ask my presenters is, what's a next step thing people can take away? How can they take things they've learned and that you've spoken about tonight, and how can they impart this new wisdom and this new knowledge onto people in their lives, their loved ones, people who are going through grief? What would you say there? It feels so foolish of me to say, how can we put this in a nutshell to have it take, because obviously it's bigger than that, but what's the easiest thing that our guests can do to help kind of share some of the stuff you've talked about today?
So I think the thought about, so these other next slides were about support, right? So having resources on hand to share with people. I didn't put the Science of Grief in there, but I put the Modern Loss Handbook, the Grief Workbook, when something terrible happens. These questions down here, though, are so important. So if we're trying to support other people who are going through grief, the question of just how are you doing, right? It doesn't need to be, oh my gosh, are you so, like, you don't need to assume, because sometimes we assume, and especially if it's like maybe a coworker, right? And they have different feelings than we expect them to have. How is your young person or family doing? Very open-ended questions, very listening questions when we're supporting others. Can you tell me what blank knows about it? So if you know a child, so I don't know, there's these resources and tools that I think that if people want to invest in them, the website up here, the nacg1.org, that's a children specific one if you have children in your life. The grief workbook is a really cool low cost sort of situation. But I think if you're going through your own grief process, I didn't have a book when I was younger. But I do like these books. I like to go through them with people in my life and offer that support. I like to use them with my clients and gift them to my clients just to see, because it might work for you, it might not. But I think that if you're going through your own grief, says give yourself grace, keep learning, keep listening. Give yourself grace, keep learning, keep listening. That means keep learning about yourself, how your grief shows up, take notice of it, identify your feelings, keep listening to your body, what you need. Let me see this one. Where is it? The power of no. Understand the power of no. If you feel overwhelmed and you're invited to all these things and you're feeling zapped, that's okay. Know the power of no in your grief. Especially if it's feeling pretty fresh that day, or especially if it's feeling fresh that year, right? There is no timeline on grief. You are allowed to feel your feelings. Give yourself grace. Keep learning about yourself. Keep listening to yourself and keep comforting yourself.
I think that's a really beautiful message, even outside of specifically grief. Like I wasn't a grief related reason, but I had to give myself permission to say no to a social event just because I burnt myself out socially. And I was like, I should go, like people are expecting me. And I called my parents because that's what I do. And I'm like, I need another adult to tell me what to do. And they're like, you can just say no. It is okay. Like you got to take yourself first. And especially when you're going through something like grief, but to even take that to other parts of your life, which I was gonna kind of be like, what would you say is the one thing that for you is like an overarching, what was the greatest thing you learned from your studies of grief that have affected the way you live and the way you go through life? And to me, this would be a big one, is outside of just grief, understanding the power of no and listening to yourself and your body and learning about yourself and your body. That would be my big takeaway. What would that was that yours, or did you have a different one that as you studied and became this expert in grief?
No, I think that's a great one, and a great reminder too. I just talked to somebody who's lost their first big person, right? They experienced their first big loss, right? They lost other people that they weren't really close with. And we discussed how grief is a new emotion, just like it says up here. It's a new emotion for many people, and it smacks us in the face a little bit. We're like, what is this? I've never felt these feelings before. And again, we have to give ourselves grace and time and space to learn about it and learn who are the safe people, who are the safe places, what are the safe ways that I can do that. And try out different stuff. And it says right here, PTG is possible. Post-traumatic growth is possible. We can grow with our grief. We can learn about it. We can learn how to care for ourselves. And we can have this wiseness of understanding that, life happens and death happens, and every day is a gift. And we're here to love each other and support each other. And as you see down here at the bottom, take care of you so you can care for others. But you are number one. You're number one.
Well, Julie, I want to be respectful of the time that you've promised us and the time we've asked of our guests. So do you want to lead us through that final breathing exercise?
Yeah, sure. If there's no Q&As, for sure, let's do a breathing exercise.
We got it. We got one of our guests has brought up a book that they found really helpful called A Grace Disguise.
Yeah, beautiful.
So I love this. This is probably one of the first programs I've run here where people have been able to really share their own experiences and resources. And I just think that's so wonderful that you've been able to create that space for everyone tonight, Julie.
Yeah. I put in the modern loss and the grief workbook. Grief workbook is pretty light. Modern loss is thick. It's got a lot of great stuff in there. And then when something terrible happens, that's a kid's book. That's a workbook where they get to draw and express themselves in different ways, which I hope you guys get to do that too. Art is such a beautiful thing. There's so many different ways to cope. You guys know about them, but all right. So let's do this.
Oh, Julie, we did get a question. And I want to make
ahead.
sure we hit it. Regarding the power of saying no, what if you are in the opposite situation? I lost my mom recently and she was my person, the one person I shared my day-to-day life with. Now there is such a void, and friends were around in the beginning, but now not so much, not regularly anyway. And I have too much alone time.
Yes. Yes. So this is something very common, like I talked about, right? Like that 3-month mark for a lot of people. I don't know when this happened for you, but there's a point where people forget what your pain really feels like, and they don't understand what you need or what you're going through because they maybe haven't gone through it themselves. So my first suggestion is to, and you might have already done this, is to tell them blatantly, I need more support. And they'll say, oh, well, what do you need? And that's your next challenge too in your grief, is to understand what you need. And if you say you're feeling lonely, you can be like, I need to have a date planned out at least once a month or once a week with one of you. You could ask multiple friends if you have friends that are available or open to this. And you can ask them, if you guys are available or open, can we make friend dates, once a week where I can just hang out and get distracted from my grief a little bit. I'm still in it. It's still very heavy. And I really am desiring some companionship and some friendship, right? And you might want companionship and friendship to do something that's grief related, maybe some support with that. You might want companionship and friendship to just get out of the house, be like, just come pick me up and let's go for a drive. Or, like make me get my ass out of the house, excuse my language. But it can be very hard. And then another suggestion is to maybe help find some grief groups, because I've talked about this with a lot of people who've been through trauma or been through grief. It is really hard sometimes to be around people who haven't experienced that intense loss of their person, like you said, because they really don't have an idea. And the best you can do is educate them and tell them how to support you or what feels good. But when we do find grief groups, and you might have to try out multiple, because not all of them. I think my mom said she went to like a church one and she was like, it wasn't good. I didn't like it. It wasn't for me. She's like, I left immediately. And a lot of them are held in churches. Not all of them are religious at all, but finding a local place that embraces the grief process, to actually give yourself concentrated space and time that's guided by somebody else to experience these feelings and emotions, so you're not doing it by yourself all the time, because they are there, they exist. And so to be in community with other people can be very powerful, whether that's a one-on-one counselor, which you might already have a one-on-one counselor who specializes in grief. If not, I totally recommend it. And you might have to try more than one counselor, because they're not all as awesome as me. But no, counseling is very personal and you need to click with the person. So it's a very hard process to find support, which doesn't feel very fair when you're already struggling, but you deserve it. And it can help. I tell you, it can ease some of the burden and the pain as you begin and continue to learn about, the process is exhausting. Jean said, yes, it is. You might need a lot of naps or rest, and you might need friends to the house, you just feel like melting into the couch for too long sometimes. But yeah, I think those are my big recommendations, is to try to understand, and you might need even a counselor for that, to come up with ways to instruct your friends how to be of a support for you as you figure that out.
I really liked what you said, Julie. This is nowhere and near the same level of grief to this guest. And I want to make sure I'm not comparing this as apples and oranges very severely. I had a friend who went through a breakup that she took very hard. This is a couple of years ago. And she did exactly what you said. She was like, I cannot be alone right now. It is painful to be by myself. I very much want to set up times. How can we best do that so I'm respectful of your schedules, but also getting that support that I need of just, and for her, it was that distraction of grief. But, and you know, that takes a lot of bravery to do. So, it's always scary to do that. But when you do, and you get that response, I know I watched it, somebody genuinely benefit from, I think more than like sitting in a room with us and like playing a game or just talking or just sitting. I think it was the fact that she was able to be open and have been received, I think was almost a bigger help for her. And also this guest says thank you to you. So
Oh yeah, for sure. And another book. Thank you, Amy. Another recommendation I have too is creating a home outside of your home to get yourself out of the house. So sometimes choosing a coffee shop that you choose to go to once a week on your own with a book or something, and you just kind of make it a ritual for yourself. And eventually you'll see the same baristas every time, and you'll see the same people sometimes when you go to the same coffee shop, and that can create a sense of community as well that is a little bit lighter than that step of directly asking your friends and or family, chosen family or family to help support you through this.
well, Julie, should we wrap up with the breathing
Yes,
exercise?
let's take a breath. So get comfortable and recognize if you can't breathe very deep, because I want you to breathe through your chest and your lungs and then your belly. That's the goal, is you fill your belly up with breath and it becomes big like a balloon, and then you deflate the balloon with your breath out. That's the goal, but it's very hard because we breathe very shallow. Anyway, so on the count of 3, we're going to breathe in through our nose, and then we're going to hold it. Then we're going to breathe out through our mouth as slow as we possibly can. 1, 2, 3. Breathe in through your nose. And hold it for 1, 2, 3, 4. And breathe out through your mouth. Slow, slow, slow. When you run out of air, do it again. Breathe in through your nose. And hold it. Get that oxygen to where it needs to go. And breathe out. One more time. Breathe in through your nose. And hold. 2, 3, 4. Breathe out slow. Roll your neck around. Give yourself some stretch. Give yourself a hug, baby. You came to a grief party tonight. It's great. You came to talk about grief, and you're brave and you're wonderful. Thank you so much for caring about this function in life that we all need to just be aware of and be loving around. So thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you so much, Julie. And thank you everyone at home. Have a wonderful rest of your evening, and we hope to see you all next time. Good night, everyone.
Good night.